Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Open Source in Business, a series of conversations with a wide lens on the role of open source in industry. We started thinking about this series as a way of really broadening the conversation about the role that open source plays in business models and in the collaboration that companies have with each other. And so over the coming weeks and over the previous weeks, we've had a number of great conversations, live interactive discussions about a variety of topics. And this week's topic is about the evolving nature of open source nonprofits and the role that they play in providing a level playing field, a vendor-neutral venue for collaboration between companies. So I'd like to invite Stephen Walli. Stephen Walli is going to moderate the session today. He is former CTO of the Outer Curve Foundation and has been a long-time open source consultant and industry expert in the business models around open source. I made a point of not saying open source business.
Well done.
So take it away.
Hi, everybody. So I think we're at this really interesting point in history. In the software industry, open source is clearly one, and there was this point where we now have literally tens of billions of dollars of software collaboratively created value sitting in nonprofits. The number is very vague, but I know it's reasonably accurate because there was a point about 5-6 years ago where the Linux Foundation did the rough calculation on what the value was. Sitting in under the umbrella of the Linux Foundation, and it was like billions of dollars. And Greg Stein at the Apache Software Foundation, not to be outdone, quickly did the calculation on all of the software under the umbrella of the Apache Software Foundation, and it was even more billions of dollars. And each of those organizations have been tracking that and continues to grow billions on billions. And that doesn't even begin to cover all of the software under the Eclipse Foundation. When you look across the Python organizations or Perl and Ruby communities. So we've ended up in a world where tens of billions of dollars of software value is held under these nonprofits. At the same time, there's an explosion in nonprofits. At this point, whole new industries are stepping into this space, hoping to create their own engine of innovation and collaboration. And we're seeing that across multiple different industries stepping up right now. And then we're also in this really strange place where over this last few years, you're starting to see some of the standards development organizations from history stepping into this open source space, starting to support open source projects. So there's work ongoing right now in the IEEE to support software projects in this space that are OSI licensed. At the same time, Oasis has started to pivot towards the open source space. And we're seeing open source organizations also organizations like the Linux Foundation have begun to step into that specification space. So we're seeing kind of traffic in both directions. And so I think we're at this fascinating time. So that's why when Dave gave me the opportunity, I was really excited to step in here. Today we have two fabulous people with a wealth of experience in the nonprofit space. We've got Karen Sandler with us, and we've got Myrle Krantz with us. And so I would not do particularly great justice to either of them. Myrle's been around the Apache Software Foundation for a long time. And at the same time, Karen, we all know Karen as the cyborg lawyer in technology. So Karen, if I could ask you to take a couple of minutes to kind of introduce us to your background in the nonprofit space.
Yeah, for sure. So I have a very winding path to the nonprofit space. I was an engineer turned lawyer and turned securities lawyer. And then I wound up getting involved in the free and open source software space. I'm super passionate about free and open source software because I have a heart condition and I have a pacemaker defibrillator implanted in my body and I can't see that source code. So living with that and having the experience, for example, of having my defibrillator shock me unnecessarily just because I was pregnant and my heart was palpitating, and realizing that pregnant women don't typically have these devices, and that what happens when your technology is not made for you in particular, through no ill will of the manufacturers, just this idea that there's a disconnect between the users of the software and the manufacturers of the software, made me really passionate about protecting all of our software, and particularly our life and society critical software. But all of our society and life critical software is now everything is connected to everything else. So I come at it from a very personal standpoint and a very a public good focused one. So I take a little bit of an objection to your introduction, Stephen, because while I do agree that open source has won to some extent, I think software freedom has not. While we have more open source software than ever before, we actually have less freedom and correspondingly a lot less control over the software that really matters to us. And this is where nonprofits can play an extremely critical role in balancing those interests and in providing a mechanism for community and collective action. So I think that there's this, which must necessarily be a part of open source business, or otherwise we have completely lost the plot. So that's sort of where I'm coming from.
Super. And Myrle, I met you at an Apache Software Foundation, ApacheCon, a while back. So please introduce your background and to why you're here.
So I got involved in open source through the MIFOS initiative initially. The MIFOS initiative was, it still is, creating open source software for the purpose of making it possible for people to get a bank account. So there are 2 billion people in the world who don't have access to banking services. And the GNOME Foundation has set out to make banking services available to those people. And their initial approach to that was to put all of the data with pencil and paper. Expo was a little bit better, but it's not a great way to save banking data. So the MIFOS initiative set out to create open source banking software. The MIFOS initiative then donated the back end of that to the Apache Software Foundation, and that's how I came to the Apache Software Foundation. And I was so fascinated by these people. I had so much fun getting to know people and learning this model of working together, that I very quickly moved into the vice president position for that project, and then into the board of the Apache Software Foundation. And currently I'm serving as treasurer of the Apache Software Foundation, so I'm more on the operations side. Because I've just been so interested in the economics of this, I've also done my master's thesis on open source in business. So it's a very nice matchup here, I think. It'd be really interesting to see how this conversation continues. I'm already fascinated.
Fabulous. So I think one of the things, we've had nonprofits in this space, and to Karen's point, all the way back to the creation of the Free Software Foundation back in, that was like 1985. And so what do each of you see as this kind of the history of what these nonprofits are for? Like, why do we have nonprofits? What's the engine? How does it help folks do these things in the open source community around projects? Karen, do you want to take a kick at that?
Sure. I mean, I was just listening to Myrle and thinking about the situation. So I'm executive director of Software Freedom Conservancy. We're a fiscal sponsor. Apache is also a fiscal sponsor, and there are a few others. The Free Software Foundation that you mentioned is one of the fiscal sponsors as well. And I think when we say nonprofits, we're talking about this like a general corporate entity, but there are many different kinds of nonprofits. In particular, there's a division between charitable nonprofits and which in the United States are 501c3 organizations and trade associations, or organizations formed around a common business interest, and those are often called trade associations. They're 501c6, and so those organizations are actually set out to do completely different things. The charitable organizations are organized in the public good across some to serve some charitable purpose, and the C6 or educational purpose, and the C6 organizations are common business interests. So the role of organizations is, it's fascinating because when you bring people together to work on software collaboratively, they need a place to collectively act. If you don't have an organization, you've either got individuals, you've got companies, for-profit companies, or you have what's called an unincorporated business association, unincorporated association, which is effectively. What's that, Stephen?
I said it's software in the wild.
So we need these organizations in order to be able to do the big things that we want to do. We can't have any great stewardship over our assets. We can't sign contracts or have conferences that are well organized or do anything together if we don't have entities that are willing to work together and have some kind of corporate form. But how that corporate form takes is really different depending on what each entity is trying to, what each community is trying to accomplish. And so I've been really inspired by all of the ways in which the charitable organizations have pioneered a lot of different models. I think that when it comes down to it, with all of the nonprofit foundations or any of these collective endeavors is to, well, several things, but one is you should follow the money. So within the United States, all of these organizations are forced to file these charitable, like these Form 990s, which are annual reports with the IRS. You can go take a look at those on irs.gov and see how much the top employees are making for their salaries. You can see how they get their money. There's this really awesome schedule, which is has a thing called the public support test. And on it, you can see where the organization, like what percentage of the money comes from the general public. And while there's a formula for that, if an organization is like at 30%, you get the sense that, oh, well, actually, they get their funding from only a few people or a few organizations. And if it's like 90% or, even like 70% higher, that they're getting their money from the general public, and there are incentives that align. So I'm going to wrap this up because I want Myrle to talk, but I'm just like, the question is really big, and the history of where nonprofits have come in and where we're going now, I think, is that we have so many that there's actually really fantastic. There's so much work that needs to be done that no one of us could handle it, even if we scaled up big, and we wouldn't want any one of us to handle all of the work, because that would be a point of failure that would be deeply problematic. And so we're in this wonderful situation where we have all of our different organizations that are willing to partner, and we each can settle into a different niche so we can each do the thing that we want to do really well.
Absolutely. Myrle. So, and I realize I'm looking back and forth across my screen, so it is kind of like we're here.
Hey. So if you look back at when the Free Software Foundation was established, and then roughly 15 years later, the Apache Software Foundation was established, there was at the time this huge conflict between this idea of free software and open software. And I think what we've determined since then is that that was an entirely unnecessary conflict. At least that was my feeling. I don't think everybody's on the same page with me on that, but there are things that are just better under a GPL license, and there are things that are just better under an Apache license, and those they work differently. They do different things. They serve different purposes. And so having both of them, as you said, each has their own niche. Having both of them is a good thing. And I think that also that this proliferation of nonprofits doing very specific things, for example, the Mythos initiative, which is basically a one project or very focused on banking, this ability to step into these niches has been made available by those first pioneers in the space. So it's partly possible because there are blueprints. There are existing foundations where you can copy the things you need out of. It's partly possible because there's infrastructure out there that is itself open source. It's partly possible because there are businesses out there that have begun to develop more abilities to support these other businesses in operations areas like accounting. So this proliferation of foundations for specific projects is, in my view, a sign of success.
Absolutely. Well, and my brain always tries to put things into buckets as quickly as possible. And I've looked at, when I look across the organizations, the one thing that they all share is that they hold assets and they remove liability from the actual participants. You know, and that, when I say remove liability, I mean it is simple things like they can hold the bank account. You know, you can sign a venue for a meetup and things like that. That it's not coming out of, you know, my personal bank account kind of thing, or my insurance is suddenly on the hook for the meetup. When you cross that line into the C6 space in America, I think it gets really interesting. Is a good word. Interesting is always a good word. To Karen's point, when I was technical director for Outer Curve, that was a C6, so it was supposed to be a member-based thing, and we had good lawyers that helped us set that up, despite the fact that there was a founding sponsor, singular, and it was always fascinating. We had the breadth of projects from lots of different places. But we struggled with that funding model because there was one, and we were supposed to be, you know, Paula Hunter was our executive director, and you know, she and I were banging on doors looking for money. But it becomes a really interesting challenge. We, at the time, so this would have been 2010, and at the time, Microsoft had been that founding sponsor, and yet there was lots of other organizations that would still kind of give anything that had Microsoft labeling close to it a kind of a scant eye, and so nobody wanted to join. And so we finally got AOL in. Yeah, there's a blast from the past, and it was. But even then, they changed leadership at AOL, and so we lost them the following year. So maintaining that funding model is really tough. But the really strange thing was, as an organization with 1 to 2 funding sources, we were still a 501c6 with no public money in this, and it was a bizarre situation. So
yeah, I would say the regulation has been really uneven.
Right.
You know, there have been times, in particular, there was a scandal in the United States that caused the IRS to take a more scrutiny, higher scrutiny for any organization that applied with the words open source in the name or in the application, which is fascinating, along with journalism and Tea Party. And now we're in a period at the moment where, you know, the US IRS has is very low resourced. And so every time I call them to ask them something, they're always like, oh man, we're never going to get to it. I'm sorry. Like, I don't know when we're going to be able to get to your, like, whenever we're not even reviewing applications. We're so slow. So, you know, I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, it's a bizarre time now, but at the same time, it's also this opportunity for evolution. Myrle, the Apache Software Foundation, for a long time, the way you brought projects in, the way you encouraged things was through the incubator, and with incubation, it was, you know, it would last 10 to 16 months of working with that project to bring it on board and kind of bring it into the Apache way. And if, you know, as I understand it, there would occasionally be times where there was a lot of friction in that pipeline. But Apache's taken that step back, and they've started a program called Petri now that's kind of a lighter weight way to begin for projects and the foundation to start to dance together to figure out if they're a good fit. Can you talk a little bit about Petri?
I think Petri is really a cool idea. So the project that I came into Apache with came in through the incubator with the idea that, so the incubator takes everything in at the beginning. It takes in all the code, you create mailing lists, you subscribe people to the mailing lists, and then you go through the process of creating an Apache conform release that is a release that's not dependent on code that's not licensable under the Apache license. And then you go through that release a couple of times, you do community building, and then you vote to become a top-level project. And there are several potential friction points along there, as you said. So, for example, if you have a whole bunch of code repositories, it can be really painful to import all of them at once. And it could mean that you have to drop development for a little while. So if you've got, for example, a very frequent release cycle, then dropping development for a little while could end up meaning you create interruptions in your release cycle. Similarly, if your release isn't yet conform with the various constraints on Apache projects, you could face bumps in the roads there, and you could end up trying to put out releases that aren't Apache conform, and then there was friction over that. And there were a couple of projects that just did not like that, understandably. There were also some personality conflicts. So occasionally it would just happen that it would come out in the process of incubation that a community wanted processes that were just not Apache conform. So for example, at Apache, we don't do benevolent dictators for life. So Linux would never become an Apache project, even if they managed to relicense everything, because it's got one guy at the top, and then a structure under that, and then a structure under that. It's very driven from a single person, whereas Apache seeks to have to avoid those kinds of single points of failure. So the Petri tries to solve some of these problems by pushing some of the process outside of Apache. Basically, this educating the community, getting the community familiar with some of these principles, that we don't do benevolent dictators for life, that the release process looks this way, and that there are certain constraints that the releases have to conform to. If you can do that before you move all of the code into our infrastructure, then you can also find problems earlier. And maybe the community really wants their benevolent dictator for life. I mean, it works for Linux, right? So why would they ever come to Apache? And if you can find that out before these projects come into Apache, and that's what Petri is trying to do. It's trying to go to these communities and teach them the things that we know, and they can take what they want and leave what they don't want. And if they like all of it, then they might decide to come to Apache. So it becomes more of a choice, of a process of deciding, rather than an upfront, like, we're going to go, and then, oh no, that wasn't so great, and then we go back, which can be really damaging to the community, and it can be damaging to the foundation's reputation as well. So I think Petri is a great idea, but it's just starting. So we'll have to see how this experiment pans out.
Super. So Karen, how do things come into the Software Freedom Conservancy at this point? Is there a process or an incubation?
So we have an evaluation committee, which is made up of volunteers who are very dedicated to software freedom, and they evaluate our applications and determine whether a project is a good fit. And we ask a lot of the same questions that Myrle is getting to as well. A project can't be a part of Software Freedom Conservancy if there isn't some real governance. We also don't accept benevolent dictators. And what we found is that there are so many ways that projects can get help now that really Conservancy is best suited to partner with projects that are really working to advance software freedom in some way. In some ways, I think of us as we're kind of meta org, because we provided a lot of our startup organizational materials and support to other organizations in the space. So for example, MIFOS was actually, Conservancy helped MIFOS initiative form on its own. So we helped transition from the GNOME Foundation to its own organization. And we've done that with a few other organizations where we help them start their own organization and coming through us as an initial first step. And some of our member projects, Outreachy is an example of this. So Outreachy is a diversity initiative where remote paid internships are provided with the goal of helping to address systemic bias and the impact of underrepresentation in tech. And so Outreachy came to Conservancy with the idea that the program would graduate to its own organization. And I think that we even mentioned it in the press release, but all these years later, Outreachy is still a member of Conservancy, so it's worked out pretty well. But the eval committee within Conservancy asks all of these tough questions about how the project is organized, and I'd say, like, especially now, we're in this great situation where Conservancy has to be really selective with its resource, or can be selective with its resources, so that we can really take on projects that we think we can assist and make a huge impact in the work for software freedom. And we happily recommend projects that apply to Conservancy that aren't a great fit to a lot of organizations in the space, including Apache or Software in the Public Interest, or even Open Collective,
Right.
which is not a charitable model.
Fabulous. Well, and that's the thing. So you've each talked a little bit about governance. Are there, the longer I spend in this space, and the more you kind of encounter the governance question and how to think about it, what I've noticed in a lot of organizations, there's a real separation, and it makes sense once you see it. It's kind of, there's an operational governance. Now, Apache has an operational governance, but then each of the projects have their own governance. And they, instead of, lots of folks in this new world, that as people come rushing into it and companies are rushing projects towards, let's do an open source foundation, they tend to immediately want to jump into building a charter. We need a way to talk about voting on things and such. And it seems to be almost centered on a fear of loss of control. But I think when you look back at the historical foundations and the work that's been done, governance is much more about doing the work and how do you make decisions. Are there specific things that your organizations look at when you're helping projects to onboard around their governance, that you can help them restructure governance or build governance for the first time if they've never formalized it? Myrle, is that part of Petrie or part of the incubation right now, is to help them walk through their project's governance to ensure that it's healthy?
Yeah, so for example, I am a mentor for a project called Weeks, which has become fairly inactive recently. And the reason is probably that they didn't have enough contributors who weren't employed by one specific company, is my feel for it. So they did really well for a while. But then that company decided to put their priorities somewhere else, and those people decided to put their time somewhere else. And so they weren't able to reach outside of that group of people, and the project is less active now. Now, that doesn't mean it's failed. It could still happen that they manage to find other participants. Even if it doesn't still happen, the code is useful to that company, and it's open source still. But it does mean that it's not a community, because right now people aren't currently active in the community. So that process of learning that for them is maybe a little disappointing, because they would have liked to actually have a project graduate to top level project. But it's one of the outcomes that you can have. It's the normal course of life. Sometimes things work out, sometimes they don't. So yeah, I mean, governance is something that that communities have to learn as they come in. There's other aspects too. It's not just a question of how many different people coming from different vendors are involved. There's also questions of how do you promote people? How do you move from user to contributor to committer to PMC member to the various other roles within the project. So and each community ends up finding their own solutions to these, but there's some general principles that we try to transmit as well, just to make sure that communities don't stagnate just because they're not promoting people at all, for example. So yeah, it's also a process of finding together with each community in some cases. So they each have to solve these problems their own way. They have a different underlying business problem they're trying to solve, or underlying user problem they're trying to solve, which is probably a better way to put it. They're trying to solve a user problem. The shape of that user problem may change how they solve the community-based problems.
Stephen,
Right.
we have a question related to this actually from me. But how do you want to handle questions during the? Will you handle the Q&A, or would you like me to butt in like I'm doing now?
I would like you to butt in, because I'm paying attention to our fabulous guests, and I can't watch the column at the same time.
So one of the things that is kind of sacrosanct in the Apache Foundation is that people participate as individuals rather than as representatives of a company. So how do you reconcile the desire to have, for a project to graduate to top-level project, a desire to have vendor diversity, and that kind of core value of participants being individuals rather than representatives of a company? Don't you have to look at the company they work for as part of your evaluation for top-level projects?
You do, and it's kind of a problem because on the one hand you're saying you can participate, it doesn't matter who you work for, and now it's like, now we want to know who you work for, but it's this contradiction that you need in order to bring that general principle forward. And if you don't do it, then you end up with communities that die fairly quickly. What happens is when the project graduates to top-level project, that's one of the evaluations that happens within the incubator before it even reaches the board. That says, okay, well, we look in LinkedIn or wherever, and we figure out who people are working for, and if 90% of them are working for one company, then maybe they need to stay in the incubator. But there's also a contradiction to that. So we've had, for example, top-level projects like Hadoop. Hadoop is a great example of this. Sometimes Hadoop has like a subsystem, a piece that they've already got in a separate repository that basically a subset of the people in the community are working on it. And then they say, well, we would like to create a separate project out of this because where it's at, it's hard to grow the community because it's hard to recognize people for just that subsystem within the entire Hadoop community. So what happens then is Hadoop splits off a project like, for example, Submarine, and Submarine, when it begins, has maybe too many people from one particular vendor, such that if they were coming out of the incubator, they'd be asked to stay in the incubator. But coming from an already top-level project, this is a way to solve the vendor neutrality problem, or at least a path towards solving the vendor neutrality problem. But once a project reaches top-level project, there's no other. Well, there's only one other specific check to make sure that that we maintain vendor neutrality, and that is when new PMC members are added, the board is notified. But for example, if PMC members become inactive or PMC members change employers, then there's no notification of that. And so it's actually possible for a project to slip into vendor domination without any sort of moment at which the Apache Software Foundation board actually sees that.
Right.
So yeah, and there's no generalized reporting about which vendor you belong to. The only moment in which that's checked is when PMC members are added, if the board checks it, and when the project graduates from incubation to top-level project. So then we end up relying on the communities to complain if a vendor seems to be misbehaving.
You need enough people that get angry then.
We had a
Oh, go ahead, Dave.
Sorry, we had a follow-on similar question also from me that I think refers to the earlier conversation where projects like Apache started as places for individuals to collaborate together and have evolved to, as Stephen said, liability shields and places that are primarily focused on corporate engagement and corporate collaboration. And you mentioned Outer Curve struggle to create that actual corporate collaboration beyond the goal of it. What are the prerequisites for creating collaborative space for corporations, and is that something that you all have in mind for the projects that you're managing in like Apache Conservancy and and other nonprofits that you're familiar with?
Karen, is that something Conservancy tackles?
Yeah. So
this idea of corporate members?
Yeah, so when projects come into Conservancy, as I said, our evaluations committee does that, does the work to evaluate whether or not they're a good fit for Conservancy. And for part of that, it's also working closely with the leadership of the project to establish governance. It's a huge opportunity at that point to have that conversation about who is leading the project and how. And it's exactly the time when we can tackle the issues like, is there a single leader, a BFDL, or is there a company that is in control of that project? And what we found is that by having that conversation and really insisting that there's working governance on the way in that is diversified, we find that either projects are really serious about it, and those companies that have control are really serious about the longevity of the project, and that the individuals do as well, or otherwise they don't. And they're not a great fit for us, and they go on their own way. And it's been there have been multiple times where it's been so painful as an executive director where I had to turn down a project that was bringing in millions of dollars because they really were just one or two companies. And, it just isn't a good fit for, it's not a good fit for us, because I know that in the long run, we're going to have a problem. If the companies are not willing to give up that kind of control, if they're not willing to bring in the real governance, if they're not willing to graduate new people, I would recommend that that any fiscal sponsor like ours establish a conflict of interest policy that applies to its leadership committees too. So at Conservancy, we have PLCs, not PMCs. We have project leadership committees. But our PLCs have conflict of interest policies. And so we have most of our projects have tight restrictions on the maximum number of people that can be employed for a particular company. And that seems to work out pretty well. Now, I kind of answered the previous question, Dave.
Yeah. I was actually, the idea of conflict rules, that's a really interesting idea. Like is it as simple as a percentage of the project leadership committee, or do you have something a little richer in terms of how you try and police that?
So it depends on our project. We have minimums that we insist on with Conservancy, but a lot of the projects come in want more, and we can tailor that. So, so some of ours have just like a minimum of 30% or even 25%, depends on the project, but usually 30% from any one particular company. But some of them have much more, and others have more granular development. And Dave's question was more focused on like, are we anticipating how to engage corporate involvement? And, that is definitely something that every free and open source software project has to focus on. How do we support and enable corporate participation while also making sure that the project has diversified governance and is focused on its long-term, its long-term success? Because if we don't focus on that, we're going to be in the problem where we have a bad experience, and we'd rather take fewer projects now and be clear about it and have a more likelihood of success than to put ourselves in that situation. And what we find is that everybody wants to have a vote on the board or a control stake, especially initially. But at the beginning, outset of the project is the best time to stave that off and demonstrate to people that projects can develop without having corporate control over the foundation itself. And that if you focus on, as Stephen says, what needs to be done, like what has to get done, and focusing on really productive governance and enabling the people to make the right decisions for the project, you really amplify the chances for success of the project in the long term.
Yes, we won't name names, but there was a very high profile project that the initial governance creation for it, the actual written down governance was way out of whack with corporate control for a particular corporation. And then even the process for how do you become a member, a contributor, like a committing member of that project leadership committee, that project management committee, was again so horribly skewed. And you looked at it and you thought, this can't last. And sure enough, it took 4 years, but it finally just collapsed in on itself.
And you can't walk it back, and right? Like once you give that control,
and you can't because at that point, everybody's belief in that project was like, well, it's broken, and it didn't matter what. There was still enormous actual engineering value there, but it's kind of, nobody wants to touch it now because there's newer, shinier things that seem to come close to it. So these are hard problems to solve. It's been interesting. So I got started in the standards world. I went through the Unix wars, and it was fascinating because there was this period where standards development organizations were all 501c3s in America. And then there was this crossover point around 2000 where you started to see new organizations were suddenly 501c6s. And that was also that same point when you kind of do the historical run back through all of the free and open source software organizations. They were all C3s for a very long time. And then there's this crossover point in around 2000 where they suddenly become C6s. And I keep thinking, what happened then? And I was actually working for Microsoft then. And that was a point of antitrust law was suddenly in the news kind of thing. And I often wonder how many corporations got nervous at that point in history and started thinking we need to be a C6 because that way we have antitrust protections. And we can have conversations to collaborate together without being accused of colluding kind of thing. It was a really interesting shift that all of these organizations started moving across. So, David, I'm seeing stuff go by.
Go ahead, Myrle.
Please.
I think it's interesting, this conversation about votes on the governance body versus contributions. So I mentioned that my thesis was on vendor neutrality, and I determined that you can't really discover vendor neutrality based on the percentage of people in the PMC from a certain company, at least not for Apache projects, because volunteers can go inactive. But what you can do is you can look at the contributions, and you can look at which contributions are being accepted based on, and then look at who the people are employed by who are providing those contributions. So you can go and you can find if there's a correlation between the number of people on the PMC being employed by Apple or whatever, and whether or not that contribution is accepted based on whether or not that person is employed, the contributor who's not a PMC member is employed by this dominant vendor. So what you can determine based on that is, are contributions important or is the employer important? Which one has the greater role in that? And I think that if in your project the contributions are what is important, then you will automatically be vendor neutral.
I love it.
You have to change philosophy.
I don't know about that. I wonder about that. I like that idea and it resonates, but I also have found that that corporations tend to contribute against their particular agenda. And so when you have a tilting towards a particular company and its customers, that can really steer the direction of a project away from a more general community. And so the contributions themselves often have a particular bias to them. I mean, not often, but it does happen. And so I agree with that proposition, but I've found that it's not always as simple as that. I don't know if you see that too.
So yes,
I love the idea. Go ahead.
So, but what happens is you get somebody coming in and offering a contribution, and then it gets rejected. And the really interesting contributions for measuring this are the contributions that are either rejected outright or simply ignored, so that the contributor eventually gives up. So it's those contributions that really tell you something, and it could just be that the contribution isn't okay, that it doesn't match the coding style, that somebody didn't write a test or whatever. But if contributions rejected are consistently from people outside of that company or people from a specific company, then it should be a warning signal. Yeah. Of course, any single measure.
Good governance to be able to put it in. Yeah. Well, that was I remember a story from probably 15 years ago now, but the head of marketing and product management for Novell was talking about their SUSE experience, and they had grown up in a proprietary world. And when they got to Novell, they were struggling with this idea of like, why do we keep contributing our best stuff, kind of thing? And and he said the switch flipped for him about a year later, when he realized that they aren't accepting our best stuff, kind of thing, and he was not panicked that all of their hard engineering wasn't getting into the kernel, kind of thing. And he was fascinated by that switch flipping in himself, of actually coming through that learning curve from his very traditional proprietary background to this, no, we have to be giving our stuff in. And I think that's, Dave asked in the sidebar there about, you know, products versus projects, and I think that's the engine that many folks get backwards when they're participating as companies, is these collaborative projects. They are sources of innovation to be pulled into products. And if you're too focused on controlling that, then you're losing all of that innovation from everybody else. Whereas if you focus kind of the product discussion for your customers kind of outward in a traditional business sense, it still allows you to participate in the project in a really healthy way. You know, you can, how you choose to package it, what you choose to offer around it becomes the real value for solving the customer's problem. And it allows the project to still be healthy, but it's a challenge.
It's something.
Do we have other questions out there, Dave?
Myrle, did you want to say something?
Yeah, just pulling in a parallel. In accounting, if you try to measure too many things or control too many things, you lose control. And it's the same thing here. If you try to control the project, that's when you lose control. It's exactly the same thing, and it's weird that it happens in multiple areas in business the way it does.
I completely agree with that. And I think that just a very quick point that, Stephen, you'd tied the proliferation of C6s to antitrust, but I actually think that it's more just this direction of expectations around control. So originally, all of the organizations, or most of them in the free software space, were charitable organizations. And then C6s started to come in and started to have some success. And I've heard from companies that wanted to participate in C3s that it becomes much harder for them to sell participation in a C3 or bringing a project to a C3 initially than it is for a C6, because there's a value proposition that they can make internally at their company, that because they'll have a seat on the board or they'll have some sort of voting control, that means that there is more value to the C6 participation for that company. And the only ways, or often the ways, that the projects come to C3s is if there's a very passionate developer or group of developers that say, no, we don't want that. We don't want that corporate control. And this is a condition for us working on this, is that we will insist on the C3. And those projects, from my perspective, now there are very successful projects in trade associations, so I'm not trying to say otherwise. And that corporate participation is a nice way for corporations to play nicely with each other when that's the appropriate model. But I find that that when you stave off that kind of control, you can foster healthy corporate participation, but you can keep that control a little bit at bay, which, you know, again, looks for the long-term success.
Right. That makes complete sense. I think one of the hard things that folks, it's difficult for folks to get their head around, if you're, and I mean as a company, if the open source licensed project that you're talking about is kind of, if you perceive it to be core value proposition to your customers, then you want control of that thing. And the further away it gets from that, you know, the more either complementary, or if it's really context. It's like Netflix and the Spinnaker project. Now, there's nothing about Spinnaker that is core to the core value proposition of delivering, you know, video to all of your devices that Netflix does. It's really a CI/CD system that's really robust at scale. I think the further away from your core mission that the open source project is, the better success you have at thinking about less control, more collaboration. That. So we're coming up on the hour. Please, Myrle.
I was saying, this brings it right back around to something Karen said at the very beginning, which is that we have more open source, but we don't necessarily have more software freedom, because we found ways to separate the value proposition of these companies, which is the data, from the source code which operates on them. They still have the data. We have the source code, but they've found another way to keep the data for themselves. And so when it comes to software freedom, we still have work to do.
Absolutely. Very much so. Yeah, Dave, you're back.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. You mentioned that we're coming up on the top of the hour, and I'd like to give you all an opportunity to wrap up. That point that Karen made about board seats being the thing that people buy really kind of drove home to me the difference between grassroots adoption of open source, where engineers adopt it because it's easy to get, and purchasing of products, which is typically top down. There's a procurement process. And that's kind of, you figure out what somebody will buy. And I wonder if nonprofits have a similar dichotomy where, the people who are actually participating in the project want liberal governance, good developer tools, and aren't really that motivated to pay for their company to participate in the nonprofits. And so the board seats end up being the value proposition that you get to the budget owner and the VP to get him involved and sold on the idea of bringing the project to an open source nonprofit.
I know how large the check is that Microsoft writes.
So I thought that was an interesting parallel. But I would like to give you all a moment to wrap up. Is there any final points that you'd like to make before we close this session?
Karen.
I just want to say that control of our technology has never been more important than it is today. I mean, I stand before you, I sit before you, I guess. I appear before you, a Karen who is demanding to speak to the manager about her source code. I think we need to take these issues seriously, and nonprofits are the embodiment of the ways we think that it's okay to do this and the ways we think we're going to be successful. And so making sure that we focus that control and that governance in ways that allow us to have more success, that keep corporate interests at bay so that companies can actually work together towards our collective long-term interest is what free and open source software has always been about. And we have always tried to walk that line. And I think that tipping the scales a little bit more towards public good and a little bit less towards enabling corporate interest will probably serve us all really well in the long term, including those very corporations who are trying to seek that control.
Well said. Myrle, what do you have to share to bring us home?
So open source is a way for us to align user value and business value and find a way where we can all participate in it together. It's been a huge movement for bringing the usefulness of software more to the human side. So I just wanted to thank you, Dave, for inviting me to this conversation. It's been really, really interesting. I've learned so much from Stephen and Karen. You guys are so awesome. And I hope we get a chance to talk again.
You're awesome too, Myrle.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I want to thank you both for joining me today. The richness of each of your backgrounds, I think, was really important to kind of bring together and have this discussion. So I want to thank you both, and Dave, thanks for having us all today.
You're welcome. And let me pitch the next episode of the series. I was looking for another word, but pitch will do. Next week, I'll have John Lilly, former CEO of the Mozilla Corporation, to talk about how Mozilla changed the internet. So it's a really interesting story about how Mozilla went from proprietary software at Netscape to open source software in the late 90s to being spun off into its own nonprofit, the Mozilla Foundation, and evolving into the Mozilla Foundation, Mozilla Corporation duality in 2004, 2005, I believe. So join us next week, same time, same channel, to discuss how Mozilla has had this massive impact on the way that we understand the impact that open source can have in the business world. So thank you all for joining me, and I'll see you all next week.